Welcome to the first episode of the Minor Compositions podcast series. Much like the project overall, it will be a space for exploring aesthetics, radical politics, and class composition. And it will also be a sort of a kind of space for rethinking the project itself. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves. For the first episode, we are having a conversation with Nick Thoburn, who is quite an interesting thinker and quite sort of embedded in the workings of how this started as a project. So without saying any more, let's turn over to him. Yeah, so the idea is I wanted to start a process of rethinking minor compositions, not necessarily as a sort of drastic rethinking. I mean, I think in some ways any practice you're engaged in, whether it's musical, publishing, or political, I think you should always be rethinking a bit, what am I doing? How is it working? Could it work differently? Is it doing what I hope it's supposed to be doing, right? So I think there should always be a bit of rethinking involved in political projects or publishing projects. But in particular, I think I wanted to do a bit of rethinking, perhaps in part because minor compositions has now been going since, first book was the Precarious Rhapsody with Bifo in 2009, so 12 years, but started planning it in 2006. So I think particularly when you get into a kind of practice or project where you're doing something similar again and again, like publish a book, have an event, publish a book, it can get very easy to sort of, let's say, get into a certain method or approach and then stay there, not necessarily because it's the best or most effective thing, but because it's just what you're used to doing. I wanted to have sort of a starting process of sort of rethinking how it's working, how it could be working, and the orientation. And part of why I wanted to invite you, Nick, was less to have a sort of like an interview about your work, but more having a sort of conversation about some things that perhaps starts from, I guess you would say, your work and ideas have always been embedded in minor compositions as a project from the beginning. In a very literal sense, the sort of the name itself is basically taken from your book Deleuze, Marx and Politics. It's also a bit from Deleuze and Guattari's Kafka book, but it's much more directly taken from your work, particularly in sort of your sort of bridging between their work and also sort of more autonomous stuff around class composition, and taking up that sort of angle. And that was the sort of starting point of the series, and something which I think is sort of filtered through the entire series and as a sort of print project. But then I also there's influences of your other book on the art and politics of book. Sorry, anti-book. I should have gone with a much simpler title rather than a subtitle. So the idea was to sort of to invite you along to have some initial conversations about sort of shared themes or ideas without necessarily knowing where it's going to go or what's going to happen, but just sort of saying, okay, I wanted to do some rethinking. You've done work and have ideas that have filtered into the project already. Let's have a chat and see what happens.
Great. Thanks, Stephen. Well, it's lovely to have the opportunity to to reflect on these ideas and minor compositions as a publishing project. And as you say, that book, Anti-Book, was very much about the practical process of publishing and the forms of publishing and the materialities of publishing, as much as it is a communist theory of publishing. I think it'd be nice if we talked a little bit about, maybe we could talk about the experimental publishing as kind of form and process, and bring in the problem of minor politics, or maybe start with minor politics. I don't know. What would you think would be most suitable?
Well, I guess to go with the first thought that comes off the top of my head, one thing that I've been sort of interested in and surprised by more and more is the ways that oftentimes when you go into, let's say, experimental political publishing, you think you want to start with the sort of conceptual theoretical ideas that guide the project, and you can try that. But then what I've discovered a lot of time is it's oftentimes very practical questions about book production or distribution or materials that end up having a more significant impact. And so I've started to think that maybe it's almost like, and this sounds almost like a sort of 1920s sort of constructivist thing, you need to start from the materials themselves and build a politics based upon patterns of circulation or production, rather than starting with a concept.
Yeah. I think that's very true. I think as sort of communists, anarchists, socialists, feminists, and so forth, we're really accustomed to, politicizing all of our social relations and encounters with the material world, until it gets to our publishing and our engagement with text and so on, at which point the material forms, processes, and relations of publishing retreat into the background. They become lost to the apparent significance and power of our words, ideas, and concepts. And I think this betrays a deeply religious and capitalist relationship to publishing. The split between the word of God and the base and corrupting materiality of books. And the book was instrumental in establishing that division. And the split between intellectual labor and manual labor, for which the book commodity was again instrumental. So I think you're right. If we're going to talk about publishing politically, if we're going to have a communist perspective on publishing, we absolutely need to bring the materiality, the forms of processes, the editing, design, visual structures, forms of distribution, economic models, all of those kinds of things need to come forward as the focus, a significant focus of what we're doing, what the publishing project is doing, but also of our critical reflection. And in doing that, that's where the most experimental and conceptually interesting aspects of publishing come forward. So it's there's a thought of publishing that arises out of the materiality of publishing, and I agree with you, that is usually much more interesting than if you come at it straight away with a set of concepts. I think it's important that when we look at the processes, the forms, the practices of publishing, the platforms, the objects, all of this, I think it's important that we don't see the material as sort of in itself political. There's a kind of simplistic, often rather retro appreciation of the materiality of publishing, which is all about, the smell of the paper, the feel of the page, the weight of the text, and so on, which we all are attracted to. I certainly am. But the point is not simply to celebrate the materiality as if that in itself was political. It's to interrogate what these forms and processes are, to understand the capitalist dimensions that they perpetuate, and to reconfigure them in critical ways, in inventive ways, in communist ways, in ways that start to fashion, I don't know, a kind of material intellectual culture that is adequate to the ideas that we develop. That's my sense of, the importance of thinking about publishing process and practice.
Let me give you something of a silly example. A year or two ago, I was working on a project with a friend and comrade, Richard Gilman-Opalski, and we had done a sort of a public seminar about we called it riotous epistemology, and it took part as part of our art exhibition, and we decided to record it and transcribe it and make it into a publication. At that point, I was really into it, and I still really like risograph printing, right? Because it's like this halfway between like offset printing and like screen printing, and it gives you this really nice texture. And so I wanted to make it as a risograph printed publication. And so I went, got it printed with footprinters in Leeds, who are a very nice worker-owned Riso print shop. Now, um, and so, but they mainly do flyers and pamphlets, right? So did the whole usual process of designing it, laying it out, went and got an ISBN for it, did the whole thing, but just published it as a sort of as a more like a pamphlet rather than a paper-bound book, right? And what's interesting about it is seeing different responses to that, and that a publication, by not having a sort of typical paperback binding, is treated inherently differently because it doesn't feel like a real book. Then it feels more like an art object rather than a book. And what I found interesting about that is, if you had asked me before that, is a book binding machine a machine of legitimation, I wouldn't have told you yes, because a book binding machine doesn't confer legitimacy of knowledge or a seriousness. I wouldn't think of it being like that, right? But there's something about, like, if it's got like a real spine, then it feels more like a real book and less like a pamphlet, which feels like it has a different sort of pattern of circulation, a different kind of let's say weightiness or lack of weightiness. It has a different sort of status as a knowledge object. So it's interesting how a particular machine that does something that I wouldn't have thought of as being the most important thing creates a significantly different sort of feel for publication, even though I wouldn't have thought about that beforehand.
Yeah, that's very nice. Yeah. So in this case, it's the object and it's the machine that produced it, and the machine that didn't produce it, if you see what I mean, and that it wasn't produced by a perfect binding mechanism. So those two things, two material qualities, immediately come into your reflections and people's experiences of what that pamphlet is. So I think that's true. That is a way that we experience and reflect on, and different kinds of platform, or different kinds of publishing platform. To me, I think it's important to. I mean, we live in a world of kind of intermedia, where everything is intermediated with everything else, through the facilities of online and digital media production. But I think for me, it's important also, and that's significant, but it's also important to think sometimes about the distinction between different publishing forms, particularly if we're interested in developing a critical engagement with our publishing practices. And so, I agree with you that the book, as something that's kind of perfect bound, that can stand on its end, as Adorno says, I think, gives it a certain kind of authority that's problematic. I think it replays this feeling that the book is some kind of is distinct from the world, something like a reflection on the world. The idea of the book as image of nature, which goes back to sort of Francis Bacon and so forth. Which gives it a sort of authority that I think it shouldn't have, and it gives its author a distinction from the world that I think is problematic. But it's part of the book as a commodity, the first uniform and iterable, standardized, mass-produced commodity that needs something of these kinds of qualities to mark its distinction. The author on the spine, the title on the spine, the protection that the harder covers give it, and so forth. Whereas the pamphlet is ephemeral. It has this sort of barbaric asceticism, as Adorno calls it, in relationship to new media. It has a kind of, I don't want to say an older quality, but it breaks with the fetishization of the new in media form. It bears age and disrepair. It has its sort of ephemerality, conjures a different kind of temporality to the speedy circulation of the commodity. And So it's sort of unpopular as well. I rather like the idea of pamphlets as being unpopular things. They don't scream their relevance. They don't tend to have their author emblazoned all over them. They tend to have a kind of more obsessive or amateur or reflexive quality to them that breaks with the enforced popularity of almost everything that we engage with in the world today, whether it's our own Facebook profiles or our latest books, or the latest fashionable commodity or something. So I think there are significant anti-commodity qualities to the pamphlet form, which can be found initially in something as apparently, as you say, something apparently straightforward as a staple binding versus a perfect binding, or what have you. And it's not only in those distinctions, but those distinctions are significant features of the differences in these forms. And that's a pamphlet. We're talking a little bit about the book as a form. There are magazines, newspapers, communiques, newsletters, slogans, tweets. Each one of them has qualities and affordances that are particular to them, as well as, of course, qualities and affordances that move across them, in different ways. But I think it is interesting to reflect on their distinction, which isn't a conservative return to form or something. It's more about seeing how form produces certain qualities and can become an object of interrogation and experimentation.
I think I would definitely agree with you that, in the sense that, and this goes back to what you said about not thinking that particular forms of matter have their own politics, but rather it's about interrogating what politics or are co-articulated by these affordances of what's being done. So rather than thinking that, for instance, what I say, that publishing a pamphlet is inherently radical, it's a pamphlet, it more has a different pattern of distribution. It's not connected to let's say an ongoing series or ongoing journal or ongoing organ of a sort of particular political line, but can be a much more temporary intervention. So it's more, I guess, almost using like a sort of a STS sort of style approach to say, what are these particular aspects of the publishing project? How were they co-articulating or meshed in a broader set of creating a politics, rather than thinking they're inherent to that form? And just so this, perhaps this is a side silly idea, but one of my favorite moments of encountering a pamphlet was I think it was the 2008 London Anarchist Book Fair. There was someone sneaking around putting anonymously printed copies of The Call onto the tables, but not telling anyone. So all of a sudden, out of nowhere, appeared this little copy of an Invisible Community pamphlet, but with like no author, no publisher information, nothing. It just was there, and that was kind of magical. I mean, eventually I figured out where they came from and who did it, but I'm not used to sort of like mysterious objects appearing out of nowhere and just be like, what is this? How did it get here?
Yeah, it confounds, doesn't it? That we, the ISBN, the author, the publisher, the colophon, all these different things help us situate, in this case, a pamphlet or any other kind of publication in a set of established and recognized and familiar modes of circulation and presentation. And you're right, when that doesn't happen, it confounds us and draws us into something in a way that's effectively intense, that doesn't necessarily have too much to do with the content, at least initially. When I write about pamphlets, I've developed this concept of the communist object, to think about the way that objects can have a fetishism, in a good way, a sort of anti-commodity fetishism. They can draw us out of our, standard patterns of use and exchange value and so on, and lead us into, novel, interesting, self-problematizing modes of relation to the world. These are very small moments. It's hardly the revolution you know, when you encounter one of these things, but in their own particular little way, different worlds, I think, can open up, can be sensed. You know, this beautiful idea of Marx is that private property, this is a quotation, private property alienates the individuality not only of people, but also of things. You know, communism is the liberation of the thing as much as it's the liberation of people. Or Benjamin's notion that communism entails the liberation of things from the drudgery of being useful. It's a challenge to most Marxism, or a lot of Marxism, which tends to think that all we have to do is reclaim use. But actually, when we get surprised and led astray and effectively mobilized by curious little artifacts at anarchist book fairs or things we find on the bus that people have left behind or what have you, there's a renewed or a different or a thrilling, joyous relationship to materials that perhaps is, you know, as I'm repeating myself, but is a, you know, a flash of a different way of engaging with the material world, losing ourselves in matter rather than always mastering it.
That's what it reminds me of. Is it Avertov who has the notion of the comradely object?
It's actually Rodchenko. Yeah, our things in our hands must be comrades. Wonderful idea.
In a way, I mean, maybe this is a bit of a stretch, but if you look at sort of changes in media production in terms of, let's say, the place of vinyl now, I think there's a similar process where because vinyl no longer has to fulfill the main role of being sort of the media form that music comes through, it can go back to focusing more on aesthetic properties of the objects rather than being like, okay, it has to do these things. It can become more of a beautiful objects rather than having to be sort of particularly functional.
Yeah, I think so we, you know, when other mediums, when other platforms start performing the use or the function, when they start sort of taking on the function of distribution, let's say, you know, so digital music replaces the vinyl, the CD replaces the vinyl, or what have you. You're right, it does sort of release that older form from some of its constraint to, as, you know, simple mechanism of transmission, and allows other qualities to sort of come forward to be more significant. And sometimes we see that in a rather conservative or retro fashion that just simply says it was better when it was on vinyl or something, so I'm going back to vinyl. But more often, I think, than not, the vinyl, as you say, becomes an exploratory, a renewed, complex material thing, you know, design thing, visual thing, sensory thing that's released somewhat from its content. And that talks to, I think, a problem sometimes when people are interested in the materiality and the design of publishing, in that we intuitively think that if material form and process and relations are going to be brought forward in our thinking about publishing, that they should that should always mirror or match or blend with the content. You know, that the content should be mirrored in the form. Although there are certainly good reasons for thinking that way, and sometimes that's an interesting way to proceed, I think there are also problems in it, in that it doesn't allow the material form, process and relation of publishing to have qualities in its own right that might have very little to do with the content, or at least little to do with the content directly, or might even be completely different to the content. And maybe what you're saying about the vinyl is exactly that. You know, the particular qualities that you find in that long player or in that 45 are not necessarily mimicking or repeating the music. You know, it'd be quite strange to say that they had to do that. Which isn't to say you don't have ricochets and relations and zigzagging relationships between form and content, but I wouldn't want to think that the two had to be married, whereas I think that is actually a common understanding of what radical design is. And also, when people talk in those terms, I often find that the design gets quite conservative. It starts falling back on some of the cliches of leftist thinking, some of the histories of radical design and so forth, rather than pushing out into new terrain, or into terrain where the design is responsive more to the social and medial conditions of today, rather than of the past.
To give that in a particular example in terms of modern compositions books, I mean, it'd be one thing to make all like very well produced, well printed, nice books. But one of the problems of that is, how should I put it? Better quality book production ends up costing more, and ends up being much more sort of, let's say, cost effective when you do it in large quantities. And if you don't have a warehouse, and if you don't want to spend lots of time and money shipping books around the world constantly, which seems a bad idea both practically and ecologically at this point, then it becomes much more difficult. So there's this balancing off of the question of, okay, well, what if we use sort of more short run printing in multiple locations around the world? And so in that case, what you're doing, the idea is you're, let's say, prioritizing a different aspect around keeping production costs lower, or distribution circulation costs lower, but not having to ship less. And so it might not be the sort of absolute best quality of print, but it foregoes another aspect, which of let's say making moving things around easier when you don't have this large apparatus of I don't have like the Verso warehouse to store things in, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, there's a lot to say there. I think so. I think of radical publishing as existing under conditions of crisis necessarily. It emerges from the fraught social conditions of class and racialization and gender and manifold other repressions, and it succeeds only insofar as it interrogates those fraught conditions. And so it can't have any happy accommodation with capitalist society. There isn't any non-crisis condition of publishing, and that crisis condition infuses the publishing form itself, infuses the relations of distribution, the economies, the design, and so on. And then there are two choices, one of which is to pretend that isn't happening, to hide all of that as best as possible, to design something so that it looks just as professional as a book by Verso or a commercial publisher, another commercial publisher. Or, and I think that this is the much more interesting route, is to accept, understand, and reflect and experience the way that crisis conditions and colors radical publishing, to find this as integral to the particular allure of radical publishing, its particular, often weird and awkward qualities as part of it, part of what we love about it. And then this is the anti-book question, then to start interrogating those and developing new publishing forms and practices and processes in relationship to those qualities. So I think of there being a sort of reflexive publishing level, which is, I call anti-book broadly, but also an inherent quality of crisis to radical publishing, which I'm not, maybe to say we should celebrate is not quite right, but we should recognize that is what we do, or that is what radical publishing is. And that's why, when you pick up something that's self-published or published by a small press, over sort of time, you pick it up and that there's something a bit strange about this. This isn't published by a commercial press. And I think that's what we like. It's a bit jagged, it's a bit uneven. I don't, the risk is that itself then becomes a fixation, that people sort of willfully badly design something, and that isn't, that's not the way to go, but most of the time. Although one of perhaps my favorite communist press unpopular books, Fabian Tomset, who produced, whose project it is, he would sometimes let in error, slippage in the type or what have you. One of them is, the colophon of one of them says unpopular, books rather than unpopular. And he's talked about that as a kind of a sort of more or less deliberate disruption of the aestheticization of printing labor, if you see what I mean. You know, that there's a tendency in artist books and some independent publishing to overly celebrate the labor of publishing, as if finally we've found a clean, free form of labor, you know. And he's saying, well, no, there's all sorts of qualities of printing and publishing that are extraordinarily inventive, but let's not think of this as liberation in itself. Let's also remember that this is labor. And so there's a, you know, a sense of almost the strike of the typographer in pulling out a particular letter, or you know, a disruption of the clean, beautiful form that troubles any understanding that the labor of publishing has transcended capitalism. And I rather like that. I think that's an interesting notion.
I was thinking about Fabian and Unpopular earlier. When we were talking, in particular, I was thinking about some of the pamphlets he did in the late 80s, early 90s, where he put ISBN numbers in it, which is quite unusual for a pamphlet. But what's nice about that is then, because he also then filed them with the British Library, that means that it's possible to find copies of them in ways that would probably be very difficult otherwise.
Yeah. No, exactly that. So, you know, no ISBN, as Bernard Celler's lovely collection has it, is a condition of small press publishing mostly, a condition of communist publishing mostly, and Fabian did the opposite. You're right, he gave them ISBN. So you have these pamphlets with this, you know, it's a very sophisticated logistical mechanism, the ISBN. It's because of the ISBN that Jeff Bezos founded Amazon on the sale of books rather than on the sale of any other commodity, because it was such a sophisticated logistical mechanism. So it seems strange for communists to stick one of those on their pamphlets when they don't need to. But as you say, it enables a kind of archiving of, you know, let's say the sort of minor publishing form within the major institution of the library, which is rather nice. It also, in one of the cases, it's also part of the playful materiality of those pamphlets, because there's one by a collection of translations of Asger Jorn called Open Creation, which has two different covers, beautifully designed. They're set out on the same plate, so there's a lot of similarity between them, but it's a different image and slightly different design. And the text, and which you're not allowed to do under the rules of ISBN. You know, the cover has to be standard, has to be the same across all editions. So the note on the back of it is addressed to librarians. It says, you might notice that the cover is different to another edition you've seen. So in order to archive this in your library, you must tear the cover off to ensure uniformity of the editions, and think of the cover only as a protective in transit and so on. So, you know, you picture these librarians having to vandalize, or being worried about whether they should vandalize the books that they're putting up on their shelves, which I think is a rather nice idea.
We did something slightly similar with, or related with the undercomments, because by Stefano Hardy and Fred Moten, because Stefano really wanted to. He wanted the book to be a 9.5 by 8.5 trim, so slightly taller than usual, which in a way would be kind of nice because it like looks and feels different by having just being slightly taller. But the problem with that is that if you're using sort of typical printing, particularly doing short run printing, adding on that 1 extra inch basically means that, well, you're using different paper, you're doing a lot more trimming, and it manages to almost double the print cost. So I was like, okay, that's a really cool idea, Stefano. But if we do that, it's either going to make the book a lot more expensive, or we go bankrupt. So the solution was, there are actually 2 different versions of the book, wow, with different trim sizes, printed in different parts of the world, with the same ISBN number.
Oh, that's nice. Great. And did it prove to be cheap, more economical in certain parts of the world to do that than in others, or it's just that was decided what would happen?
well, what it ended up being is Stefano wanted to do a sort of run of several hundred, basically, so he could give them away. And so the ones that were given away were slightly larger and had a slightly different pagination because the different that size shifted around a few pages.
Right.
So it's almost like there was the, I guess you'd say, the anti-commodity, slightly larger version and the regular version.
So the free copy was actually, the gift was actually the one that cost more to produce than the commercial one. Yeah, I like that. That's good. Yeah, there's, this sense in which, so we've talked mostly, I think, today in terms of qualities of sort of, barbaric asceticism or cheapness, or, the crisis condition that means that design has to be minimized or what have you. But it's nice also to push it the other way sometimes. As you're saying there with the gift, or, the famous example is Guy Debord and Asger Jorn's memoir, hugely expensive book to produce, I imagine, bound in a sandpaper that destroyed the cutter blade in the print shop, so it's terribly destructive of, I don't know, capital, if you like, destructive of machinery that was used in the production of the book, and that was at least nominally given away for free, an excessive, sumptuous gift. So we certainly shouldn't be thinking that publishing is only, or radical publishing is only, it can't be, I don't know, can't be luxurious, although I'm not really keen on that word, can't be sort of excessive sometimes in its particular ways. But it's true that usually, I tend to find that overly designed or overly aestheticized books don't have quite the same appeal as that which is a little bit tatty.
Yeah, makes sense. Another thing I've been sort of thinking about, and I guess this has been part of this, one of the sort of key principles in Marx as a book series, was starting it all, also having all the books available free online. And the logic there was partially to get around issues of distribution, because it oftentimes you can get around like a freely available book much easier around the world than if you're only moving around physical stuff. And I think that's been quite helpful. And I think that it's really enabled a much broader distribution for a number of books, and allow people to read them that would have gotten otherwise. But I've also started to think that there's maybe a limit to that, and that just making a book freely available online doesn't sort of doesn't get rid of all barriers to access. And so I was starting to think through what are the sort of, let's say, the limitations of digital publishing as well as what it affords and enables.
Yeah. Well, this is a big question for our time, isn't it? I like your point there that free distribution is actually easier than commercial distribution, given that commercial distribution is, as Marx says, it's about abolishing space by time, if it's that way, right? So the market facilitates the ever faster circulation of goods, but actually in this case it doesn't. You find it easier when it's free to circulate it, maybe not faster, but in ways that are conducive to its readership and consumption and so on. I think there's a tendency, open access obviously is hugely kind of important as a development, of our time. But I think there's a tendency, or maybe less so now, there was a tendency for a period to see that as in itself, the fundamental terrain of radical media or something, that once we make it free, then everything, somehow all the other problems are resolved. And obviously that's not the case. The capitalist structures of publishing publishing is absolutely infused with capitalist paradigms. We could sort of spend all day enumerating them. So the fact that something might be free hasn't saved us from those, from the structure of the author, from its relationship to leisure and work, from its sort of separation of ideas from material form, or, we could keep going. So I agree that open access in itself shouldn't be everything. And of course, it also presents problems to the economic viability, of a radical publishing project. I don't know whether you have found that, one of the stories is that open access actually increases sales, but I suspect that isn't always the case. If it did, then that would be fine in terms of the economic viability of a publishing project, but I suspect it isn't. And so what do we want? We're all happy to read The Guardian for free without becoming subscribers, or at least I certainly am. But I don't feel the same about radical publishing. I want to support radical publishing, and radical publishing doesn't exist in a liberated vacuum that doesn't need money. It's as much a part of this world as anything else. And maybe I think we are moving more to a model where people will pay to support projects that they agree with. I think we're moving more to a model of kind of subscription again, and so on. So I think that is good. It's not that using money is good in itself, but we do live in capitalist societies that have to support, where we have to support each other, mostly or often through the money form. And so it'd be a shame to say that the only people that can't support themselves through the money form are radical publishers. Although, that I think that's perhaps a fallback position of quite a lot of people without quite thinking about it. If the content is revolutionary, then it should always be free. I think that's problematic. I mean, we want it to be free. We want as a friend said last night, we want, if the book is the first commodity, we want it also to be the last. And we need to be making those efforts, but we haven't got there yet.
I think the way I've been thinking about it is maybe, almost like what choices are being made and what effects does that have more broadly. So for instance, okay, I haven't paid myself for any of the work in minor compositions, but I'm able to do that because I have a sort of regular paid stable university job. So if you have radical or experimental book production being done by people who have other forms of paid employment that are secure, that sort of, let's say, enables a certain forms of things to happen that maybe wouldn't happen otherwise. But that also kind of then restricts who is able to be involved in doing that work. Or same thing where like, if you're not paying your authors, because you're part of a shared project where you're more concerned about producing things rather than the money, that enables certain kinds of, let's say, maybe books to happen that wouldn't happen otherwise, but it then also restricts who can do the writing and who can be involved in producing things, because people need to eat, and so it's interesting. I mean, I don't want to get too into it, but if you look at, let's say, the difference between AK Press US and UK, if you look at sort of how they operate differently, just based on the fact that people, the ones who are still in the UK, can rely on public housing and forms of healthcare that don't exist in the US, that creates a difference in orientation based upon just very simple, being able to survive questions. And because they don't exist in the US, you end up being much more focused on having to sell this many copies to be able to be this profitable in order to not starve.
Yeah, there's a really nice essay by Pauline van Murik-Broekman, one of the founders of Mute magazine, about the problem of independence in media, independent media, autonomous media, and so forth. And she says this is essentially a sort of Euro-American or a global northern sort of model that imagines it is independent, when, as you say, it's supported by, whether it's social housing or decent jobs or welfare payments or what have you, that are thoroughly capitalist, and that those facilitate the capacity to imagine that you're autonomous or that you're independent. Whereas in the global south or in more impoverished situations, everybody knows that their whole mode of being, everyday life, is always infused by capitalist relations, and including their media. So yeah, I agree. We need to rethink we need to be much more critical of the idea that one is ever independent of capital. even if certain aspects of the publishing project do pull away, from capitalist patterns. And this, this might sound a little bit depressing, but actually, this is the proletarian condition, writ large. It's the condition of being traversed by sort of fraught social relations that are always pulling one out of shape, and that it's those social relations that are the object of critical intervention. So, while one is kind of coursing with capitalist social relations, that also gives those capitalist social relations they become the condition of our politics, which is very exciting, and that's why Marx, for example, is I think a social revolution rather than just sort of, bourgeois identity or citizenship or something like that. So if publishing is pulled out of shape by economic relations, that's how it is. That's the proletarian condition. And we shouldn't imagine that it isn't, kid ourselves that it isn't. And if we don't kid ourselves that it isn't, then we then really have a terrain of intervention all the time. Everything, the most personal, as Deleuze says, is hence always coursing with global social forces, cosmic social forces even. Can you have cosmic social forces, cosmic forces?
I'm not sure what a cosmic social force is, but I like the idea of it. But I guess it gets you back to the idea of how you take those fraught social relations that are enmeshed within publishing, are enmeshed within the production process, and try to highlight them and work through them as, bringing them out as part of the process, rather than hiding them. Or trying to gloss them over. Maybe it gets a bit to like, this could be a stretch here, but like when Brecht talks about the alienation effect, the V effect, where you're sort of breaking the fourth wall and saying, no, actually, we're doing this as a way to get you to think about that. There is no sort of like natural relationship between audience and theater, or between reader and producer of media object or media process.
Yeah, I agree. So I think that's half of it. That's sort of why I call my book anti-book. There's an estranging effect because we're also infatuated with books, including myself. To be anti-book seems like a terrible crime against culture and humanity and all that is good and true. But actually, we need to recognize that books, as I've said, are infused by commodity relations. They were even the first mass-produced industrial commodity. So one aspect, I think, is exactly that, drawing attention to the capitalist paradigms, structures, economies, and so forth that publishing bears and extends and facilitates. Another, and this is the communist approach to publishing, or the anti-book approach to publishing, is to try, it's a fraught and complex process, but to try and wrench those forms, processes, and relations into communist forms. And I, in my book, I look at a number of ways of doing that. One of them is through anonymous collective authorship, for example, troubling the distinction, the notion of the author as fount of individual creativity in favor of a distributed, unclaimed, self-contradictory mode of collective writing. Or the way, to mention Newt magazine again, the way I think it produces what I call a diagrammatic model of magazine publishing that is adequate to the fragmentation of the working class, that since the 1970s, the loss of class identity in favor of distributed, fragmented, global experience of class means that you can't any longer have a unified center of textual production in the way that Lenin imagined the newspaper, for example. And instead you have to develop ways of distributed publishing, and the magazine is one way to do that if you interrogate the different ways it can engage with readership, and the ways it can engage with writers, and the ways it can refashion what it is to write editorial, the way you can reimagine different kinds of temporality depending on the different forms or platforms or situations that ideas are being emerged from. Or this lovely notion of Deleuze and Guattari's of the rhizome book as a way of trying to break the centralized, unified, subjectivized authoritarian form that the book is. So I think that the beauty, if I can use that word, the brilliance, that's a better word, of experimental, political, radical publishing is precisely to wrench these other material forms out of the crisis conditions of publishing. It's quite rare to achieve that very, I think it's quite a rare thing, but it's beautiful when you see it.
Yeah. Do you have any favorite examples of what you think that's happened or has gone well?
Yeah, so I think, as I said earlier, I think it works differently with different forms. So pamphlet, magazine, book, author, and so forth. My kind of favorite more recent example is this great book called the 2015 Baltimore Uprising, a teen epistolary, which assembles, some 650 screen grab tweets of the Baltimore uprising, the pursuit that followed on the police murder of Freddie Gray, and it's like a collision, if you like, of Twitter and the book form, in this very stripped back, a kind of poor image, sort of ripped and remixed aesthetic quality that seems to sort of reproduce and undo Twitter at the same time. It's very different to the proto-genre of Twitter books, which just sort of pull the text out and then turn the text into a kind of poetic form. Here, the visual image of the Twitter page is visible, but kind of cheapened, ripped, remixed to become a new kind of aesthetic, political aesthetic, I think, of the image. But what it does. So that's what it does to Twitter, but what it does to the book is remove all of the mechanisms which establish its commodity form. There's no ISBN, there's no editor, there's no author, there's no page numbers, there are no chapters, there's no introduction. The book form is stripped away, but it also, it's quite an amazing achievement. It also draws in the problem of racial violence and resistance to racial violence, and the problems of resistance to racial violence through, particular techniques, like it redacts the eyes of the protagonists in ways that's really quite disturbing. It feels like a removal of subjectivity in a sense that I understand to be mirroring the bar to Black subjectivity that is presented by civil society. It removes any notion of narrative progression towards liberation. There's no movement to the great overcoming of racism in the book. There's much more a sense of being confronted by the horror of racial violence and explosive resistance to it. And it also removes a kind of empathetic reading that is so common to our radical thought, that we think that when more sort of privileged, racialized or class groups encounter, racialized or oppressed peoples, that somehow our response should be, or rather the publisher thinks the response should be empathetic. I think this book kind of refuses an empathetic reading that insists on the very particularity of this explosive moment that white kind of bourgeois readers can't easily digest, maybe. So that's certainly an example that I think is really extraordinary. And it's super cheap. It's produced for free, but it's produced with a copy scan and so forth, with a tape-covered spine. It's totally photocopied.
That sounds interesting, and it sounds like it's trying to keep that moment of discomfort and undigestibility and keep that in the form itself, rather than trying to sort of like scrub it away so it looks nice for like the proper book object.
Yeah, and it is, you would more conventionally, I think, call it a zine, and it fits more clearly in those kind of zine aesthetics. But I like to think of it as a book because it's not perfect bound, it's tape bound, stapled then with a piece of tape down the side. But I think that takes it into the realm of the book form, and which makes it more interesting because it's I call it a riot book. The riot erupts through the book form. Whereas if they had let's say, instead put it online, as a sort of website, or distributed it as a PDF or something like that, it would have different qualities, that I think would be less interesting. And I've given talks about it where people have said, yeah, but because it's got a small publishing run and it's not online, way fewer people are going to see it than if it was a website. But yeah, I think that misses the point of what it is that we do. No one really thinks that by producing something like that, we're slowly inching towards the revolution. If like another 1,000 people saw this book online but lost something of its particular intervention in the world of books, I think it would be less interesting.
Well, perhaps less people will see it, but maybe there are certain, let's say, differences in how people engage with it by how it's produced that are being prioritized over just number of eyeballs seeing something as being the end-all be-all thing to be considered.
Right. Yes, exactly. And our eyeballs are glued to a kind of a gargantuan volume of data. So, these kinds of things that we produce are not ever going to rival that in terms of volume. There's a nice, interesting line from the communist Gilles Daudet, where he says, even when we do have a kind of, a sort of Niagara flow of leftist publishing, it doesn't make much difference. Let's not delude ourselves that revolutionary forces emerge out of the volume of publishing. Ideas, concepts, publishing, this is all really important, but it doesn't create explosive moments. These happened. These are much more rooted in everyday experiences and so forth. And that that's true for Marx too. He understands that the word of revolution is not what causes it.
The thing I used to say when I was involved in sort of curating exhibitions is the important thing wasn't the stuff on the wall or the gallery, but rather what kind of social relationships were created in and around and through the stuff being there. In a certain way, perhaps the more important thing isn't like how many copies of a book are printed or what kind of media it's produced in, but rather what social forms are attached to, or flow through whatever media is being produced. And thinking about sort of how to vary the media form in order to do something different with those kinds of social relationships. So whether it's a short run of that might try to get people to engage more or differently, or that could be actually the point.
Yeah, and these are so it's this changed social relationship. It's also with this Baltimore Uprising book, it's also the changed your sensory relationship to it, your physical relationship to it, your imaginary relationship to it, your sense of what it is to actually feel and do and engage with an uprising against racial terror in a book. All of that it's a kind of critical reconfiguration of what we are as we consume these things, and that will only be small. It'll happen very occasionally. It'll be a flash, but I think these little flashes are also really significant as, I don't know, as they're not prefigurative exactly, but as moments for, as signs perhaps of the possible reconfiguration of human life that will have to occur in the overcoming of capitalism. The experiences of it, perhaps flashes of it, but yeah, I guess the mistake would be to think that if we just have more of those, then capitalism will be overcome. That's to have a religious understanding of what publishing is, the word of God and so forth.
Well, that's all for our first episode. Hopefully by the second, I will have figured out more what I'm doing. That's all for now.